Good evening and welcome to the forum. I'm John Mattison. Tonight we're going to be talking about the municipalities and their dysfunction, and I can think of no better person to talk about it this week of the local elections than Dr. Crispian Olver. He's the author of 2 books on our cities. Crispian, welcome.
Thank you, John. Great to be joining you on this show.
Yes. Now, you wrote 2 interesting books, How to Steal a City, The Battle for Nelson Mandela Bay, and then you also wrote A House Divided, The Feud That Took Cape Town to the Brink. And so you've seen it from the ANC, an ANC-run city and a DA-run city, so you've seen the whole catastrophe.
Yeah, very interesting comparison.
Yes. Just a bit about your background. You were a medical doctor, you qualified, you became an activist, you joined the ANC and you went into government and you became Director General of Environmental Affairs. You must have watched this week the election results with the ANC's continuing decline with very mixed emotions.
Well, I have to say it was an earth-shattering week. The ANC suffered a very serious drop in support.
Yes.
Going below 50% countrywide.
First time in history.
Yeah, losing a lot of ground in the metros. Its main opposition party, the DA, similarly didn't do very well. They were hemorrhaging votes to the right and to the left. And a lot of the smaller parties, Action SA, Good, even the EFF held their own, the Freedom Front. So we're dealing with a much more diverse political landscape.
Yes. 2016, the last local elections were a political earthquake. The ANC at that time didn't expect to lose Johannesburg, Tshwane, and Nelson Mandela Bay. I suppose this time they're slightly more prepared.
Well, I think the ANC knew that they had a tough battle on in the metros. The problem for the party is that a lot of its intrinsic governance problems in local government haven't been fixed. Yeah. It's got a party funding model that has basically been built on the back of the rents that can be extracted out of local government, and with some notable exceptions. I mean, it's governed well in some municipalities, but on the whole, it's built its municipal administrations in order to feed the patronage machine. And that's had really disastrous consequences in certain cities. And we saw that particularly in Nelson Mandela Bay. I mean, what attracted me to that city was the way that a criminal syndicate had taken charge of the regional ANC office, had then used that to capture the municipality, and were systematically pulling resources out of every one of their big infrastructure areas. The Nelson Mandela Bay went through, a really unstable period under ANC rule, and eventually they lost the confidence of the people. They were voted out.
Yes. Now, you referred to the party funding model, but I also wanted to ask you about the funding model we have for our cities. And I think my impression is it's even more dysfunctional in the smaller towns. Was the conception in 1994 correct? I mean, are our cities designed to be funded adequately?
Well, there is a very active debate on that very subject. And if you ask anyone in local government, they're going to tell you straightforward the answer is no. That
Right.
you know the revenue base given to local government was simply inadequate for the extensive set of services that, that they're meant to be providing.
And had
So,
to be
you know,
extended to the historically disadvantaged population had so little in the past.
Correct. I mean, massive service delivery obligations. And, you know, initially local government did very well in rolling out new infrastructure services.
Right.
But the problem has been in maintaining those services. And, you know, the one thing that we've never really been able to get on top of as a country is around payment for services. Part of the problem is that a lot of these historically disadvantaged communities are simply too poor to afford municipal tariffs. We did have free basic services implemented as a policy, but the problem arises once 2/3 of your city's residents are all on free basic services and unable to pay. The municipality just doesn't have the tax base to function.
Right. Now, I mean, how are municipalities funded? There's rates, but the rates only come from those people who can afford it. And then also electricity, that seems problematic.
Yeah, so the principal tax instrument that local government has is property rates.
Property rates.
And those are based on both the raw value of the land and the value of improvements on that land.
Right.
And, you know, ordinarily that would compare with the kinds of, and what property rates are meant to fund is all of those services that you can't levy a tariff on. So things such as roads and road maintenance, curbs and, you know, the cutting of grass. I mean, there's a string of services that municipalities provide that you can't easily attach a revenue stream to. Electricity and other services like water, sewerage, and refuse collection. These are services that you ordinarily you can bill people for. So tariffs are levied on households and properties, and they pay. And that's where the free basic services idea came in. So poor people can't afford to pay those tariffs, and they get subsidized up to a certain minimum amount of service.
Now, the dysfunction in smaller towns like Mangong and even smaller towns seem to be worse than the bigger towns. Is the reason for that lack of funding, or is it incompetence and corruption, or is it equally both?
You know, if I was, I do think there is a funding issue, but I don't think it's the principal issue.
Right.
I would say that it's at its core a capacity issue, and it's a function of weak management.
Yes.
And that weak management derives, I would argue, from undue political interference in the business of running a municipality.
And is that political interference by whom? Is it by members of the council, or does that extend to the party apparatchiks in the area as well?
Well, it's both. It started out as councillors taking far too active an interest in the appointment of staff in the municipality, and in an interest in supply chain matters.
Right, so it wasn't an interest in just getting the best person for the job. it was part of the patronage process, which became the dominant interest of many councillors.
Yeah, you know, listen, every party that comes into power in a municipality thinks that the best way to get on top of the situation is to appoint people they trust into senior management positions.
Right.
The problem in local government is that it's a highly technical area. I mean, you know,
Right.
you need engineers and technicians and town planners, you know, technically trained people that know what they're doing and they know how to run infrastructure services. You need proper accountants running the, you know, the municipal finance department and the budgeting process. And the minute you start to pack these positions with political appointees, and I mean, I have to say, it's not only the ANC that's been doing this. I mean, I've picked up instances of this in some DA-run municipalities. I've picked it up where the EFF has had an undue level of control over the municipality. It's an affliction that all parties are prone to. You know, they want to see politically loyal people in senior management positions, but it means that you compromise on the hardcore technical skills that you need to run a municipality. And I think it's a little bit of a South African disease. You know, our politicians have too all-encompassing a view of themselves and their powers, and they don't respect the separation that has to happen between the political terrain, which sets policy, sets the direction that we should be moving in, and the administrative terrain, where you know, let your managers get on and actually run the system.
Right. Well, this is a really important point, but we need to take a break. We'll be right back talking to Dr. Crispian Olver.
Cool. Happy?
Keep going.
Yeah, we can keep going. 3 done?
Right.
Go. 3, 2, 1.
And we're back talking to Dr. Crispian Olver, author of How to Steal a City and a House Divided. Crispian, is the underlying problem a problem of how we conceived of our municipalities in 1994? In other words, I mean, I think at a national level, we have a real problem because members of parliament and members of provincial councils aren't directly accountable to constituents. Now, there's a whole debate about the proportional representation system versus the constituency system. But even at city level or municipal level, where you have ward councillors, they don't seem to be playing a key role often that you would expect in a democracy, where the local people, when they have a service problem, they go to their ward councillor.
Yeah. Look, it's quite hard being a ward councillor because the residents in your ward see all of the problems that they're experiencing as being the responsibility of the ward councillor.
Right.
In actual fact, we've given ward councillors very few powers. So they don't control municipal services. They, you know, are one person in a whole council, and often they are the, how do I say it, the least powerful. It's parties use, for those that they want to really appoint as mayor and get onto the mayoral committee, they use their councillors on the PR lists to do that, because that's where parties have the most amount of flexibility.
Right.
So it tends to be that your PR councillors actually politically are stronger than your ward councillors. And even then, your ward councillors, don't have any legal powers to make sure that services are being provided.
But, you know, if one thinks of other countries, the ward councillor doesn't necessarily have direct power, but runs around and pressures the executive to get things done. Is the explanation you've just given, is that the reason why it's less effective here?
Well, all I'm saying is that I think it's really tough being a ward councillor.
Yes.
And I don't want to make excuses, but ward councillors have to mediate a lot of very pressurized demands from residents. And, you know, the good ward councillors, and I've met some ward councillors that I consider really excellent.
Yes.
From all parties, you know.
Right.
And, you know, these are people that take their residents' complaints and they will go and bully their way through this bureaucracy until those issues are resolved. And,
right.
You know, then they will come and report back to their community and say, you know, X, Y, and Z, and this problem I couldn't fix, and this is the reason for it. Those are the sorts of people we should be celebrating. Right. I'm afraid they're few and far between.
Right.
And you know, a lot of ward councillors, you can't find them. You ring them on their phone, they don't answer, and people just give up trying to get anything resolved through them.
Right. I want to move on just to have one question about your experience in Nelson Mandela Bay. You went in and your role was to try and clean up a corrupt and non-functional municipality and the ANC party side of it. What did you find?
Well, I was quite struck. I mean, I'd heard that there was corruption in Nelson Mandela Bay. It was the reason I got sent in. What struck me and was something that I just didn't expect was how systematic it was. And I mean, okay, granted, this was a system that had evolved at least since, you know, the early 2000s. So by the time I came in, this was 2015.
Right.
It was well entrenched, but it amazed me that almost every area in the municipality where you could generate some sort of rent-seeking or corruption had been turned into a revenue stream.
Revenue stream, you mean going into private hands?
So this is basically the privatization of monies that should ultimately be going to the municipality.
Right.
So, you know, the big drama that everyone heard about was the bus rapid transit system.
Right.
And, you know, there'd been a huge amount of money, billions of rands allocated to it. And at the time I came into the municipality, they still hadn't got a single bus on the road. They were all standing idle in the workshop, and a lot of money had been siphoned off that project. But this was going on in pretty much every other area, you know, infrastructure and engineering contracts, IT contracts, human resources, personnel management contracts, the stadium. You know, Nelson Mandela had this beautiful stadium built for the 2010 Soccer World Cup.
Right.
The management of that stadium had been turned into a money scheme. Waste management, the hiring of dump trucks, property rates and rebates on property rates, town planning permissions and the zoning approvals for new developments. You name it, the list goes on. So it was literally any area I looked at, sports and recreation, economic development, the fresh produce market. So that struck me. Every area had been monetized. Secondly, it was systematic. So it had a center which was being run out of the ANC regional office. And basically the procurement and appointment decisions in the municipality were being made in Florence Matumela House. That was the ANC's regional office. And a lot of ANC councillors were appalled by it. They were elected to run this municipality. They would get instructions from regional office to say, appoint this person, the parties decided it, award this contract to X contractor, the parties decided it. And then there was this informal network of enforcers. And, a couple of councillors stood up. There was this one speaker, ANC appointed speaker, Maria Hermans. She did not want to be party to this, and she stood up and opposed these instructions. She was bullied and hounded and threatened with her life for taking a decision like that. So, there was this informal enforcement system that really made it very tough for councillors on the ground to be standing up against these thugs.
And just to sort of bring it round to the present, to what extent are those practices still in place, and to what extent have they been stopped?
Well, the ANC's done an enormous amount to try and rein that in, including, they've been championing this new legislation on party funding and the transparency around party funding.
Right.
And, there's been a lot of work to try and roll back corruption at local government level. The problem they're facing is that to transition a party from a system where it's, basically run off kickbacks from municipal contracts and appointments, right, takes time. And to do that overnight actually poses very serious problems to the party. So they've rolled back a lot of this rent seeking, right, but it means that the funds into the party have dried up. And,
exactly. But don't you really need to replace that with public funding that is transparent and public?
I agree. I think we should be funding parties out of the fiscus. Right. It'll cost, but what we will save in terms of stopping looting and renting and state capture would be enormous. Right. So I think there's a very solid argument to be made to be funding parties directly from the fiscus.
Yeah, I work for the United Nations on election management, and of course in South Africa a little bit as well. And I spent a lot of time in the States. I have no doubt in my mind that the biggest corruption in the United States democracy is campaign financing. The fact that they get so much money for privately, and of course it's used for advertising and all the other things.
Yeah, and I mean there it's just institutionalized. It's there's an elaborate system,
and it's harder to stop once it's functioning, because you'd have to rein it all back. But here we should be able to do it, because we still do have reasonable laws controlling party advertising and so on.
Yeah. And again, this is not just an ANC thing. So
oh no, it's national.
The EFF's no shrinking violet when it comes to shaking down municipal contracts. The UDM that I encountered in Nelson Mandela Bay, there was a disastrous mayor there for a short period of time, Montgomery Bobani. He was involved in a number of operations to extract funds out of the municipality.
We have to take a break, but I want to come back to that when we do. We'll be right back. And And we're back talking to Dr. Crispian Olver. Crispian, you talk about the UDM. I must say, I was really surprised and disappointed because I'd always thought the UDM was run unusually honestly among South African political parties.
Yes, I was also taken aback. I mean, I've had the greatest respect for General Bantu Holomisa. I mean,
yes,
he's been, you know, a champion of good governance issues. But,
right.
you know, I encountered the UDM from the other end of the system, and there, you know, Bobani was undoubtedly involved in the bus rapid transit system. In fact, in many respects, he was the smartest councillor in the room because they only had one seat in council at the time, and he was teaching the ANC councillors tricks and how to set up these contracts, and it was under his tutelage that they plundered the bus rapid transit system. When this city manager was brought in that stood up against them, her name was Lindy Msengana and Lela, they chased her out, and Bobani was leading that, the hue and cry to get rid of.
I want to move on to Cape Town in part because we don't have him here to defend himself. But so you then wrote your next book on Cape Town, which is DA run and the legend is that it's well run and less corrupt. What did you find?
Well, the DA certainly, Cape Town is far better run than the other metros in South Africa, and they had over a long period of time built up what I would call a meritocratic culture in Cape Town.
Yes.
So very strong technical people at the top of the municipality. Yes. But it was not without its own problems. And this goes to the heart of how the DA itself funds itself.
Yes.
So the DA doesn't operate in the way that the ANC does. They don't shake down supply chain contracts. They've instead got an entrenched set of relationships with principally property interests in Cape Town,
right,
who they actively look after and nurture through the policies that they pursue and the developments that they push. And I was extremely interested because at the time, Patricia de Lille was mayor in Cape Town.
Right.
And she was aggressively driving a number of property developments that, according to the officials that, you know, I was speaking to all of the planning and the engineering officials in Cape Town, these developments did not make sense. They were on floodplains, they were in nuclear evacuation zones, they were on areas that you needed to recharge the Cape Flats aquifer. And when officials stood up and blocked these developments at a bureaucratic level, these officials were singled out and targeted and fired and ejected from the system. And I was extremely interested as to why this was happening in the supposedly well-run city. Why are you operating against these officials in such a heavy-handed manner when all they're doing is giving sage advice and doing their jobs?
Right.
And I traced the story all the way back to what were the property interests at play. They were all making generous donations to the party. There appeared to be a fallout at some point. You know, Patricia was bringing a new set of interests in. She was very closely linked to Tokyo Sahwali and Mark Wilcox and others. So there clearly were new players coming in under Patricia. And my reading of the battle was that what really frightened the DA was when they saw that Patricia was playing their property resourcing game, but the funds weren't coming into the DA coffers. And then they knew, you know, she was starting to build up a war chest and lead a breakaway movement. And that's when the real, battle erupted out into the public.
Yes, and it seemed to have been very clumsily handled.
Very.
Just before we leave Cape Town, I wanted to ask you, because you would have had fresh eyes on it, the allegation that Cape Town serves the white, wealthier areas, the leafy suburbs, but not the townships. Is that the case? Is it worse in Cape Town than in ANC-run towns?
Well, it certainly at a policy level, the DA prioritizes middle class and more affluent areas much more than ANC-run municipalities do.
Right. Does
What
that mean the black traditional townships are prioritized less than ANC towns?
Yes, correct. But it's not an absolute point, and certainly what Cape Town's been doing a lot with their transport corridors, etc., I think has had huge benefits into some of the more disadvantaged areas. But in general, Cape Town's infrastructure services are better managed. So what you lose on the swings, you gain on the roundabouts.
Right.
Policy-wise, there's a lower level of prioritization, but in terms of aggregate management levels of, say, water infrastructure or transport infrastructure, Cape Town scores higher than the other metros.
Crispian, looking at the problem of our towns generally, what kind of reforms are required to fix it? Does one have to change the PR system at a local level? Because you say that the PR councillors have more authority than the ward councillors, just in practical political terms. Does one have to change the funding model? Is there need for a constitutional change or a legislative change?
Well, I would have said the change that we need to orchestrate is at its core a political change.
Oh.
And if I was to cut to what I think is the heart of the problem in this country, our politicians that are elected into local government have an overweening sense of their own power and importance.
Right.
And they believe that by dint of this so-called executive power in local government, they can then dictate how the administration is run.
Right.
And it's this crossing over of what I would call the political administrative interface that is really where the seeds of many of these problems arise. What you need to do is appoint a competent municipal manager to run the municipality, and you need to let that municipal manager then get on with the business of running that. Don't put political appointees into positions that are ultimately technical in nature.
Right.
Municipalities need to be run by trained engineers and town planners and accountants, and the various technical disciplines under that that are required for running complicated things like sewage treatment plants, etc.
And just extending that point, my sense is, but please tell me if I'm wrong or to what degree I'm right, that the smaller towns, I've been told, they've got rid of their engineers. So whereas the big towns, it's bad enough, but they do have engineers. The smaller towns, they've got rid of the engineers. And at the same time, my sense is that mayors of small towns live too much of a high life. They drive the sort of similar fancy limousines to the ones that mayors of big towns do, and that they're paid handsomely for the kind of town, what the town can afford. Is that correct, or is that a prejudice?
No, I think that's completely correct.
Yes.
You know, our local government councillors want all the trappings of office, even though they can't run a proper municipality or gather in the revenues that are due to it.
Now, the removal of engineers, is that because they're redirecting resources to their own interests, or is there another reason?
Well, I think it's ultimately due to appointing political apparatchiks into these posts, who are often not adequately qualified.
Right.
And then once a system is broken and dysfunctional, and often dysfunction serves a particular purpose, because the more chaotic it is, the easier it is to loot resources.
Right.
Then your good people just leave. They take jobs elsewhere. They don't want to be party to a system that is so broken and non-performing.
Yes. And I suppose then that they're using the resources in that way, they then run out of resources.
Yeah.
We're going to have to take a break. Our last break. When we come back, we'll be with Dr. Crispian Olver. And we're back talking to Crispian Olver. Crispian, what do you expect from the Zondo Commission? It seems to me that the Deputy Chief Justice Zondo is planning to make recommendations in his report that touch on these very sensitive but central issues. The way that that party deployment and cadre deployment interferes with the way the Constitution is supposed to operate. I know I've seen it when I go to Parliament. I've been proposed for a position on the SABC board or the ICASA board, the Independent Communications Authority. One gets a very strong sense that under the law and the Constitution, that interview should be where the decision is made. Does the nominee have the qualifications and answer the questions well enough? But you get a very strong sense that the decisions have been made somewhere else, and often one is aware they're made in the Thule House. Am I being unfair? And do you expect the Zondo Commission to take a stand on that? And do you think he'll have a chance of making recommendations stick?
I would hate to presume what the Deputy Chief Justice is going to be saying in his report, but judging by the line of inquiry,
right.
It's clear that he is very interested in the party-state relationship,
right,
and how that should function in a constitutional democracy such as ours.
Right.
So I would be very surprised if he doesn't make findings on this area. It certainly is a systemic problem that we've been facing as a country. And I guess you can say, I mean, there may have been a point in time, when, in the immediate post-apartheid period, when you were trying to clean out an ossified, anti-democratic, discriminatory bureaucracy and
right.
put a new administration in place. Yes, I can understand that at that kind of moment in time, you needed aggressive transformation
right.
to take place, and the party had to play a strong role in driving it. That time is gone. And as you say, a constitutional democracy empowers certain institutions with decision-making power so that there are checks and balances in the system. And the minute you pull those powers back into the party, and the party is now making decisions about different organs of government that are meant to be acting as a check and a balance on each other, then you've basically torn the Constitution up.
Right.
You're ultra vires the Constitution. So I think this is a profound moment. I think the Deputy Chief Justice's report, which is one of the most eagerly awaited interventions in this country, I think it's going to have very far-reaching implications for us.
And do you think that the political authorities are open to taking that seriously? I mean, do you see real change potential coming about?
Well, I do think the current ANC leadership is aware of the unsustainability of the current system. I think they are, on the whole, genuinely committed to reform. And I think they will take the findings from this commission very seriously.
Yes. Well, that is some cause for hope, because I agree with you. I mean, my sense is Justice Zondo feels very strongly about this issue, and it is a highly sensitive issue. So looking ahead, what these elections, we don't know how the coalitions are going to come down. That could take days or weeks to be settled. But do you see the rise of these new parties, Herman Mashaba, for example, in his Action South Africa? Is that a positive development or more of the same?
John, I would want to hedge my bets.
Yes.
We've had an unhappy experience of coalitions in this country. I mean,
Right.
On the whole, coalitions have been associated with more political instability, and that because of the kinds of way that the politicians interface with the administration, political instability at the top messes up the bureaucracy, and it becomes paralyzed and unable to function.
Right.
So I do think a lot depends on the maturity of the parties in negotiating these new coalition arrangements. In principle, more competition at the local level should be better for democracy, and it should translate into better accountability to the electorate and better service delivery. But I do think it means that the parties need to find common ground, establish agreements on principle, not on just what they can get out of short-term advantage. So they need to put some sort of common coalition agreement and governance platform in place. And I would like to see, as part of those coalition agreements, an agreement to not interfere in the administration, to respect the independence of management, and to let them get on and do their job and to support them.
Right. You know, there is one political development that I think hasn't received enough discussion, and that is the potential, and as I say, we don't know how the coalitions are going to be settled, but if in the 2016 election, the DA was fighting the President Zuma's ANC and would not contemplate going in with the ANC. And the EFF was also fighting the President Zuma's ANC so hard that they were willing to go in with the DA in some sort of ways. This time, the political landscape is different, and there seems to be a chance that at least in some places, the Democratic Alliance and the African National Congress could go in together. Do you see that, a chance of that? And could that turn out to be a positive step in bringing more experienced players together and sort of acting as a sort of powerful check on each other, because the DA wouldn't, is stronger than the alliances the ANC has had in the past?
I think it would certainly make for a more stable relationship.
Yes.
these two parties occupy the middle ground on the left and the right.
Yes.
And in a sense, what we're talking about is a series of grand coalitions.
Right.
The difficulty is that both parties have been implacably opposed to any kind of coalition arrangement. I know there was one experiment in the Western Cape, which the party officials on both sides were very unhappy about. Basically, the local councillors took it upon themselves to enter into a coalition agreement.
Right. Yes.
But the DAs stated publicly that they will not go into any coalition with the ANC in its current form. So they would need to backtrack on that undertaking. But it would be an interesting arrangement, and certainly a grand coalition would be far more stable and would stop these small parties having, this kingmaker status and then basically pulling the plug on these coalitions when they don't think they're getting enough of a lift.
Yes, and well, just to close, a lot of this kind of speculation arises because of the state of the ANC. I mean, many people, President Cyril Ramaphosa retains very strong personal support, but there's still he has some greater personal support than the ANC, and the ANC itself seems to contain some of these negative influences in both the main factions in the ANC. How do you see this all resolving itself?
John, you're asking me to gaze very deeply into this crystal ball. I'm always an optimist. I think the reformers within the ANC are in the ascendancy. And I think there are, the outcome of this election, I think, has been a terrible blow for the party.
Yes.
I'm hoping it'll do some serious introspection and, come back to the table stronger and reinvigorated and able to continue the reform process that they've begun.
But does it strengthen the cleanup part of the ANC or the other part?
The argument could be taken either way. I'm pretty sure there are going to be people that are from the radical economic transformation faction that will argue that this is all Cyril Ramaphosa's fault.
Yes.
I think that would be a mistake if that argument wins the day. I think what we're dealing with is the legacy of the Zuma state capture period. And, the electorate is, finally indicating to the party what it thinks of, a couple of decades of mismanagement.
That's a very a sobering and slightly and potentially optimistic note to end on. Crispian, thanks so much for talking to us. These books are both very worthwhile reading if you want to understand the underbelly of South Africa and its cities. Thank you for watching. Hope to see you again next week on the forum.